It's time to welcome back Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser is a U.S. Navy vet, a medical doctor, and the leader and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Like me, he's a man committed to his faith and in love with our nation. Welcome back, Zuhdi.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Denny. Thanks for having me back.
Actually, since you're a Navy guy, I should have said welcome aboard, shouldn't I?
Yes, sir. Great to be on your ship.
Zuhdi, let's start with your background. You were born and raised in America and ended up in the U.S. Navy for a while. Talk about that.
Yeah, my parents escaped the Ba'ath regime, which is still in power under Assad in Syria in the mid-'60s, and I was born a few months after they got here. I grew up in Wisconsin, and after being accepted to medical school, got accepted also for a Navy scholarship, and was on the Health Profession Scholarship Program. After finishing medical school, did my training in internal medicine at Bethesda Naval Hospital, was chief resident. I also served for 2 years aboard ship on the USS El Paso, was part of Operation Restore Hope in Somalia, and then ended up serving my last tour as a physician to Congress. The medical clinic that takes care of the members of Congress and justices is a Navy clinic there at the attending physician's office. So it's, I never imagined that the son of immigrants from a dictatorship that escaped to be free here would be able to be a physician to the members of Congress and serve in the Navy. It was a very honorable experience to participate in.
You served the Navy, you got out, and then you started the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Why did you do that? And what is the mission of that group?
As with many, many Americans, 9/11 changed our lives significantly. And I had come to Phoenix, Arizona, joined my father in practice in 99. A couple years later, 9/11 happens, and all of a sudden I realized, as did many Americans, and I write about this in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, in which I open it in the first paragraph and say that, I had only been out for a year, and I thought maybe I need to sign up to get those bastards back again, because I realized that the battle that my parents had escaped in the Middle East had come here to attack my fellow countrymen, my fellow Americans. And it was a problem that only we Muslims can solve. Al-Qaeda, be it the fact that 15 out of these 19 were from Saudi Arabia, terrorism is a symptom. Al-Qaeda is a symptom. ISIS is a symptom. The disease is theocratic political Islam. And I realized that we needed, I was listening to all of the talking heads and especially the Muslim leaders that were giving excuses, blaming the West, blaming Israel, every conspiracy theory known. And they were like the alcoholic that refused to acknowledge the first step, which is that they have a problem. And the Muslim leadership in this country are Muslim Brotherhood apologists that are looking to create Islamic states, and they want to decrease the power of the West globally. And I realized that we needed to form a non-Muslim Brotherhood, an anti-Islamist organization, and our American Islamic Forum for Democracy was hatched in 2003, and our mission was to battle for the soul of Islam, to support liberty and freedom through the separation of mosque and state, and that's really the way to solve this problem long term, and I think that's the greatest battle of the 21st century.
Well, that certainly makes a lot of sense. And by the way, your book, The Battle for the Soul of Islam, is one of the very few books that lives on my desk. I got a big bookshelf, but that is an outstanding book that explains a great deal. The topic today is that radical Islam is a lot bigger than ISIS, because an awful lot of people tend to say, okay, they're the bad guys, and that's it. And that's overly simplistic. Is that a fair way to put it?
It is. I mean, right now, President Trump, I think in the campaign, was right to talk about Islamic radicalism, to insist on naming it what it is. And it goes beyond simply naming it. Once you name it as Islamic, it wakes up the Muslim community to say, hold on, you guys have a problem, you have to deal with it. And I think actually by calling it radical Islam, you narrow the problem down from all Muslims down to those who are radical, who have this ideology. Now, it's a significant problem within the community, but by not naming it, you create two extremes. One is the majority of Americans will think, well, wait a minute, maybe all Muslims could be a problem. Or the other extreme, which is, well, there's no problems at all. It's just a psychiatric criminal problem, which is also this anesthesia that doesn't get us to anywhere. And I think ultimately this is the problem. Right now, the President Trump, as our commander-in-chief, seems to be in the last few weeks retreating away from identifying it. His speeches on 9/11 avoided the use of the term Islamic. Vice President Pence, in his speech, refused to use the term. His speech on Afghanistan and his change in policy did not mention Islamic. Actually, Sebastian Gorka left with a resignation letter saying that was the explicit reason why he left the administration, was the lack of persistence in defining this problem as Islamist. And that worries me, because when you have military solvers, if you will, be it General Kelly, General Mattis, those guys, they're heroes, and they're going to solve ISIS. But you can get rid of ISIS tomorrow, and in 6 months you're going to have a new form of it that wants to form a caliphate, a new radical group. And unless we look at this like a Cold War on steroids, which is, again, the Cold War against the Soviets, while the Soviet Union's gone, Russia's supremacism, its communism, is still not gone. It's still a problem, and we need to continue to advance freedom and democracy. And similarly, we are fighting a battle against Islamic theocrats, be it the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Saudi Wahhabi Sharia state, the Egyptian Sharia state. All of these different Sharia theocracies are a problem, and we need Muslims to engage in this long-term reform, and that's what our Muslim reform movement seeks to do.
Wow. This is Colonel Denny Gillem on Frontlines of Freedom, and we're discussing the breadth of radical Islam with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Zuhdi, I've always felt, as a military guy, that I need to know who my enemy is, and you need to name them so that I'll know who they are. I'd like to see Congress declare war, and it sounds like you're saying the same thing similarly to what I've been saying. It is the radical Islam theology that's different than the state of Germany or something like that. But we need to name it so we know how to go after it, and you know when you've defeated it. I don't understand why we can't do that.
I'm with you. If we can, let's parse what you just mentioned. If we're talking about ISIS, if we're talking about Islamic Jihad, various radical Islamic groups, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, I'm all for Congress making a declaration of war. I think the rest of it, the ideological battle, much like in the Cold War, we had a Committee on Present Danger, we had a U.S. Information Agency, we had a number of elements of Congress that were moving to create policy and funding to combat the ideology that pretty much a vast majority knew that we had to combat, and they did it through continuing resolutions and other things that made a statement to the sentiment of Congress. I would be against a formal declaration of war against an ideology, because the only way to defeat bad ideas is with good ideas. So if you have mosques, for example, in the United States that are preaching violence or have arms or whatever it is, then those should be shut down, and that's not, and the Constitution doesn't support that. But if you have mosques preaching hate, anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, while that's abhorrent and we need to reform it, as in Brandenburg versus Ohio, the Supreme Court ruled in that KKK case that ultimately it's protected speech. It may be abhorrent, but it's protected speech. And I will tell you, the Middle East has proven that when you try to violently or push these groups underground, it actually fuels them. The reason the Brotherhood won the election in Egypt, the reason AKP now in Turkey is running the government and Erdogan is out of control, is for years his movement was underground. You can't monitor things that are underground. You can't defeat them when they're underground. So just as we want to defeat the socialism and the communist ideas in America through debates and public exposure and the antiseptic of sunlight, I think similarly with Islamism, domestically and globally, it's much better to defeat it through public debate.
And there's a lot more to discuss about the threat of radical Islam, and Dr. Jasser is going to stay with us. This is Colonel Denny Gillem on Frontlines of Freedom. Go out on your lawn and do 103 push-ups. Then do 20 more sit-ups and take a break, but stay in the area. Denny Gillem, this is the final formation for this hour on Frontlines of Freedom. We're continuing our conversation on radical Islam with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Zuhdi, there are a large number of Muslims in America. Virtually all of the ones that I know are like you and me. They're good Americans. And these friends are very upset when Muslim groups demand things like certain food in jails or establishing Sharia law in communities. What's an appropriate response for Muslim Americans and non-Muslim Americans who don't support this kind of stuff when this happens? What's an appropriate response for those who don't agree with these demands for special treatment?
Well, I think now, if we were talking September 12th, 2001, or any time in 2002, I'd say, condemnations of terror, things like that are important. But we're 16 years now after that, and we're well beyond simply condemning acts of violence and expecting them to simply say that, well, we're not radical, we're not militant. They need to start dealing with the disease. Our community needs a 12-step program, and we're barely past the first step 16 years into this. So we're past the denial. Now we got to get into engaging our community, and it's just like treating drunk driving, right? You don't just wait at the bars to make sure people don't leave with their keys and with their vehicle. You treat the disease and the families and the homes of alcoholism. So the Islamism, the political Islamic supremacy, the fact that most of the Muslims you and I know don't believe in Wahhabi fundamentalism, but yet the books on their shelves at home are all from Saudi Arabia. And those books aren't treating about the beauty and equality of Jews and Christians and Muslims. Those books say that they're infidels who are going to go to hell, etc. And we need to demand, put a fire under the feet of Muslims to say, listen, you guys need to start creating institutions that leave a legacy that is compatible with American ideas, that is compatible with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I would tell you to tell your Muslim friends, look up our Muslim Reform Movement. We have a 2-page declaration that has a statement of 15 principles, and with 3 different sections, one on peace and security, the other on free speech, and the other on freedom of thought. And on those 3 areas, we declare that we reject all forms of the caliphate, any form of the Islamic State. We reject any laws against apostasy, any laws against blasphemy. So if Muslims are going to live in America, they shouldn't just say that we are going to follow the laws of America, but that if Muslims are a majority, be it in Egypt, Malaysia, wherever it might be, that they would also have similar laws to America, not have an Islamic State. Because if you're just 1% of the population, obviously Muslims aren't going to take over America. But they can't be an insurgency here by saying that, well, we follow the laws of the land, we're not anarchists, but if we're a majority, we're going to tank the Constitution and put the Quran in as the Constitution. And that is a schizophrenic approach to your own society that is devoid of an honesty about the reform that your own faith needs to undergo.
Zuhdi, that really spoke to me. The recognition that people in general, and particularly people who tend to be radicalized Muslims, you should be joining the societies that you're in, not trying to take over the world one way or another, even if it's peacefully by a vote to vote out the Constitution and in the Sharia law or whatever it is. Be very faithful to your faith, but don't tie it to politics. Is that a fair summary of what you're talking about?
Yeah, and I think the realization, Denny, that needs to be made is that the direct dots that are connected is that it's not just the extremists and the means that they use to get there. The only difference between the Saudi royal family and Al-Qaeda is the Saudi royals have formal militaries. They wear suits and ties when they're in the West. They look all westernized, but yet their laws, they beheaded more people in Saudi Arabia than ISIS did. So their laws are the same. They're just not virally chaotic like ISIS is. They're an organized theocratic dictatorship. And ultimately, we as Muslims need to realize that currently we have no books that are compatible with Jeffersonian democracy. So if you believe in Jeffersonian democracy as a Muslim, you have an obligation to leave a legacy that creates institutions that are like our American Islamic Forum for Democracy or like our Muslim Reform Movement. People can go to MuslimReformMovement.org, take a look at our website, look at the declaration, and see if, the Muslims or if you're Muslim, see if the ideas that are at your mosque are compatible, with what we talk about there. Because if they're not, you are leaving a legacy of theocracy regardless of what you may fool yourself at home to think is your version of Islam.
Wow. I certainly see and agree with that. This is Colonel Denny Gillem on Frontlines of Freedom. We're discussing the breadth of radical Islam and how to deal with it with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Zuhdi, it seems to me that a good solution for non-Muslim Americans who have interaction with Muslims to know more about your organization, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, to give us some tools and some things to bring up in conversation that are not just touchy-feely good feelings, but take us towards the root of the problem. Why don't you talk a little bit about the resources you have available for people and mention the website a couple of times?
Sure. You know, our goal is to create a movement. It's to change a consciousness, and there are different platforms that we do that. Currently, the main platform, obviously, is media, on radio programs like yours, on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and we've gone from simply our American Islamic Forum for Democracy to a larger movement that includes bipartisan or nonpartisan liberals and conservatives that form this coalition that shares one thing. It includes folks like our organization that's conservative with liberals that are gay rights activists, feminists, but we all share one thing, which is we believe that the Islamic State is a theocratic, evil state. That's an idea that we need to defeat and replace with classical liberalism or liberty, if you will, and begin to work with scholars that can reinterpret the Quranic passages that the Wahhabis, we believe, misinterpret, and begin to marginalize hadith, which is sayings of the Prophet that we believe are either illegitimate or need to be circumscribed into history, and separate what is history in Islam from what is interpretation and modern thinking. So those platforms include not only media, but business, working with chambers of commerce to look outside the identity of being Muslim outside the mosque, but into regular society. Platforms at universities. We speak to debates with professors and others that don't necessarily agree with our ideas, and speak to kids, parts of the student organizations. Also interfaith organizations at mosques, synagogues, churches, and temples and others, to begin to engage on what real interfaith diversity is all about, and remind people that diversity in the Muslim community is not about ethnic diversity of Arab and Pakistani and African and Western, but diversity of thought, that it should be based on liberal versus conservative versus reform versus modern. That's what diversity is all about. And unfortunately, right now, the Muslim community leadership is all monolithic and is not looked upon as an ideological, diverse community. And the last platform is government. We like to hopefully shift the policy in the U.S. government from being one based on countering violent extremism, which is a symptom-based approach, which has been a disaster, to countering violent Islamism, which is an ideological approach to engage reformists like our Muslim Reform movement.
That makes good sense. And you use the phrase, I think I picked it up from you. You are a Muslim. An Islamist or Islamism is somebody who is on the extreme. Did I pick that up right?
Yes, I'm Muslim as anyone who practices Islam. Islam is the faith. Islamist is a political movement that believes that the state identity and the legal system and the party, like you say, communist or socialist or capitalist. Islamist is somebody who believes the political party should be an Islamic party, like the Muslim Brotherhood is the classic Islamist political party. So those are the Islamists. So our work is against any mixture of religion and political party identification.
Zuhdi, thank you so much for that. One more time, what's your website?
Our website is AIFdemocracy.org, AIF as in forum, democracy.org, and also take a look at our coalition, which is MuslimReformMovement.org.
Zuhdi, thank you so much for taking time to join us today.